My night was supposed to be a celebration of sisterhood, but I woke up in a bathtub of ice-cold water with the most dangerous man in Korea looking down at me. My best friend, the person I trusted with my life in a foreign country, had drugged my drink and sold me to my destruction. Then he appeared, 6 feet of tattooed, lethal elegance, and the air in the penthouse went cold like death had walked into the room. He pulled me from the water, wiped my face, and told his men I was his now. But when I asked who he was, his answer froze my blood. "I've been watching you since you landed in Seoul, Aaliyah. Now that you're in my house, you're never leaving." I had no idea if I'd been rescued or claimed by a monster. What happened over the next 24 hours changed everything. "I'm sorry," she hadn't said. The words never came as Keisha slipped the pill into the sparkling cocktail at the Elite Soul Lounge. Aaliyah's hands had trembled as she reached for the glass, her heart hammering with an excitement she thought was for the party. The bass of the music throbbed through the floor like a heartbeat. Neon lights flashed against the massive windows overlooking the city. Everything was perfect. Everything except the sister she thought she had. Now, Aaliyah drifted in and out of consciousness, the humid air of the private suite thick with the scent of expensive coal and danger. Welcome to the Heart of Seoul. Here, we don't just tell stories, we explore the intensity of the human heart. Subscribe to stay connected. We're delivering regular doses of the unexpectable right here. The steam in the private penthouse suite was thick, a humid veil that smelled of expensive cedar and the clinical metallic tang of blood. Sao Dong-min sat on the edge of the massive marble tub, his wet, dark hair falling loosely around his face as he watched the water ripple. He was a man of lethal, coal-dark eyes and skin covered in bold black ink, a ruthless mafia boss who ruled through a quiet, predatory menace. Behind him, his security chief stood with a hand hovering over a weapon, the air in the room charged with a pre-earthquake silence. Then, the water shifted. Aaliyah Grant drifted back to consciousness, the ice-cold shock of the water clashing with a heavy, disorienting haze of the drug Keisha had slipped into her drink. She was a stunning black woman, her hair slicked back and her white sleeveless top clinging to her smooth, deep brown skin from the water. She gasped, her lungs burning as she looked up into the face of a man who looked like death walking. "Kill her," the security chief barked, the command slicing through the humid air like a knife. "She's a breach. She's seen too much." Sao Dong-min didn't move. He reached out, his tattooed hand, covered in intricate patterns and a striking portrait tattoo, gripping the edge of the tub just inches from Aaliyah's face. He leaned forward, trapping her in a dangerous bubble of authority and forbidden intimacy. He expected her to scream, to beg, or to wither under the weight of his criminal influence. Instead, Aaliyah's gaze remained steady, despite the vulnerability of her position and the lingering effects of the drug Keisha had slipped into her drink. She was drawn into the danger, but she was not intimidated by it. "You have a choice," Sao Dong-min murmured, his voice a low, resonant hum of hidden authority. "You can be a body we discard, or you can tell me who sent a lamb into a lion's den." Aaliyah swallowed, her throat moving with a courageous curiosity. "I wasn't sent," she whispered, her voice a low, warm hum that vibrated with the truth of her betrayal. "I was sold." The intensity in Sao Dong-min's expression shifted, a restrained obsession flickering in his eyes as he realized she was a targeted victim of the very world he controlled. He gestured for his men to stand down. He had been watching the shadows of Seoul for years, but he had never seen a heart as fearless as the one currently shivering in his bathtub. Aaliyah drifted from the cold, suffocating memory of the bathtub into a world of oppressive softness. She woke up in a sprawling bed covered in charcoal gray silk sheets, the fabric cool and expensive against her skin. The disorienting haze of the drug had begun to lift, replaced by a dull ache in her temples and the heavy, humid silence of a high-security penthouse. She was alone in a room that felt like a fortress, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering, indifferent skyline of Seoul. Every movement she made felt like a heavy, rhythmic discipline. She sat up, her white top now dry, but still bearing the scent of the cedar-infused water from the night before. On the nightstand sat a sleek, black tablet. With a trembling hand, she activated the screen. The name flashed across the display, confirming the nightmare, Sao Dong-min. The digital footprint of the man was a masterclass in quiet menace. He was the head of an empire built on fear and precision, a ruthless mafia boss who moved through the city like a predatory ghost. Aaliyah felt the oxygen leave the room as she realized she hadn't just stumbled into a bathroom, she had collapsed into the private sanctuary of a man who made people disappear. The door clicked open with a clinical finality, and Sao Dong-min stepped in. He had shed his suit jacket, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the dark ink trailing up his neck. He moved with a predatory stillness, his cold, dark eyes locking onto hers with an intense, restrained obsession. "You're awake," he said, his voice a low, commanding hum that vibrated through the silk. "Who are you to me now, a captor?" Aaliyah asked, her voice steady despite the frantic rhythm of her heart. He stepped closer, his presence creating a dangerous bubble of authority that made the room feel humid and thin. He leaned over the bed, his tattooed arm bracing against the headboard to trap her in his space. "You are a protected secret, Aaliyah. The world outside thinks you disappeared in that lounge. If you leave these walls, my enemies will finish what your friends started." Aaliyah's breath hitched. She was no longer Aaliyah Grant, the independent expat. She was a piece of leverage in a war she didn't understand, claimed by a man who looked at her with a terrifying, raw want. The clinical silence of the penthouse was broken only by the low, digital hum of the monitors as Sao Dong-min led Aaliyah into his private study. The room was a sanctuary of dark mahogany and cold technology, dominated by a wall of high-definition screens that flickered to life at his touch. Dong-min stood behind her, his presence a heavy, predatory stillness that trapped her in a dangerous bubble of authority. He didn't speak. He simply pressed a key, and the shadows of the underground lounge from the night before flooded the room in grainy, neon-streaked detail. Aaliyah watched the screen, her heart performing a frantic, wary rhythm as she saw herself and Keisha sitting at a corner booth. On the video, Aaliyah looked radiant and unguarded, laughing at a joke Keisha had just made. They looked like sisters, a picture of the lifelong loyalty Aaliyah had believed in with every fiber of her being. "Watch her hands," Dong-min murmured, his voice a low, commanding hum that vibrated against the back of her neck. Aaliyah's breath hitched as the footage slowed. She watched as she turned her head to wave at someone across the room. In that split second, Keisha's movements became sharp and clinical. Her best friend reached into her clutch, withdrew a small white pill, and dropped it into Aaliyah's untended glass with a practiced, terrifying precision. There was no hesitation in Keisha's features, no flicker of regret. Only a cold, focused calculation that made Aaliyah's blood stop. The purity of Aaliyah's world didn't just crack, it detonated. The sisterhood she had cherished was revealed to be a scripted drama of betrayal, a 6-month lie hidden behind smiles and shared secrets. She watched her digital self take a sip of the drink, saw her own eyes grow distant and disoriented, and watched as Keisha casually checked her phone while Aaliyah began to stumble toward the back of the lounge. "She didn't just leave you," Dong-min said, his cold, dark eyes locking onto hers in the reflection of the monitor. "She stayed to make sure the drug took hold before she signaled the men waiting in the garage." Aaliyah pulled back, her fingers curling into her palms until her knuckles turned white. The disorienting haze of the drug was nothing compared to the visceral reality of the video. She looked at the man beside her, the ruthless boss with the bold black ink and the quiet menace, and realized that the monster in her life wasn't the stranger who had found her in his bathtub. It was the woman she had called her best friend. Aaliyah moved through the silent halls of the penthouse, her bare feet pressing against the cold marble as she sought a single point of exit. Every movement was a heavy, rhythmic discipline, driven by a desperate need to reclaim the autonomy Keisha had stolen from her. She reached the heavy obsidian doors that led to the private elevator, her fingers trembling as she pressed the sensor. It remained dark, a clinical refusal of her freedom. She turned to the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the glass was bulletproof and reinforced, locking her into a glittering high-altitude cage overlooking the indifferent sprawl of Seoul. The door behind her opened with a finality that made the air in the room turn thin. Seo Dongmin stepped into the hall, his presence a predatory stillness that seemed to absorb the light. He had discarded his shirt, the bold black ink of his tattoos crawling over his shoulders and down his neck like a living warning. He didn't rush toward her, he simply stood there, trapping her in a dangerous bubble of authority. "You are not my prisoner, Dongmin," Aaliyah countered, her gaze steady and intimate despite the frantic hammering of her heart. "I have a life. I have people who will look for me." "You have a traitor who sold you in a city that thinks you're dead," Dongmin replied, stepping closer until he was mere inches away, his brooding, dangerous aura overwhelming her senses. He reached out, his tattooed fingers grazing the line of her jaw with a restrained obsession. "If you walk out of that door, you aren't walking into freedom, you're walking into a target. Keisha didn't just drug you, she branded you with my name to save herself." Aaliyah's breath hitched as she looked into his cold, dark eyes. "What do you mean?" "My enemies watched me carry you out of that lounge. They've been waiting for a crack in my armor for a decade. By waking up in my bed, you've become the only thing I can't afford to lose. To the rest of the world, you aren't a guest or a victim. You are my weakness. And in my world, a weakness is either guarded or destroyed." The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just hiding from Keisha, she was being kept as the ultimate prize in a war of lethal elegance. She was trapped between a best friend who wanted her gone and a mafia boss who refused to let her go. The heavy, humid air of the penthouse felt still, a dangerous bubble of silence that allowed the distant hum of soul to fade into nothingness. Aaliyah sat on the edge of the velvet chaise, her hands still trembling slightly from the drug's lingering tremors. Seo Dongmin approached her with a predatory stillness, carrying a glass of water and a small silk compress. He knelt before her, his proximity creating a pressurized intimacy that made the room feel thin. As he leaned forward to press the cool silk against her temple, his white shirt hung open, exposing the bold black ink that claimed his skin. Aaliyah's steady gaze drifted from his cold dark eyes to the intricate patterns on his shoulder. In the soft amber light of the study, the tattoos didn't look like mere symbols of criminal influence. They looked like a map of a hidden past. Her fingers, moved by a courageous curiosity, reached out to trace the striking portrait tattoo on his bicep, a woman with eyes as haunting and restrained as his own. "Who was she?" Aaliyah whispered, her voice a low, warm hum that vibrated in the small space between them. Dongmin's hand stilled against her head, his expression intense yet restrained. For a moment, the ruthless mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man haunted by a heavy, rhythmic discipline of grief. "The only person who loved me before I had to become the monster the world sees," he murmured, his voice a low, commanding hum that lacked its usual bite. "She was lost to the same snakes that Keisha just sold you to." Aaliyah felt a jolt of recognition. The ink wasn't just decoration, it was armor, a bold black record of every loss he had suffered while building his empire of fear and precision. As he looked at her, she saw the emotional depth beneath his controlled exterior, a reflection of the same betrayal that had shattered her own world. "You use the ink to remember," Aaliyah said softly, her fingers lingering on the portrait, "and the blood to forget." Dongmin didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into her touch, his brooding aura softening into something that felt remarkably like surrender. In that quiet, intimate moment, the lines between captor and protector blurred. He was helping her recover her strength, but as her gaze locked onto his, it was clear that she was the one beginning to see through the darkness of his ink to the man beneath. The clinical silence of the penthouse was shattered by the sharp, rhythmic vibration of a phone against a glass table. Aaliyah reached for it, her heart performing a frantic, wary rhythm as she saw the name on the screen. Keisha. Before she could touch the device, a tattooed hand covered in bold black ink and intricate patterns slid into her view and snatched it away. Seo Dong-min stood over her, his wet, dark hair falling loosely around his face, enhancing a brooding, dangerous aura that made the room feel humid and thin. He swiped the screen with a predatory stillness, his cold, dark eyes narrowing as he read the message aloud. "Aaliyah, please, I was scared. They forced me to do it. I'm at the old apartment. Come alone so I can explain. I'm so sorry." Dong-min let out a surprised laugh that carried no humor, only a lethal, quiet menace. "The trader's price is always paid in lies," he murmured, his voice a low, commanding hum of hidden authority. He looked down at Aaliyah, his expression intense yet restrained, trapping her in a dangerous bubble of authority. "She isn't at the apartment to apologize. She's there to lure you out for the men who paid her." "I have to face her, Dong-min," Aaliyah countered, her gaze steady and intimate despite the betrayal that had shattered her world. "You won't face her," Dong-min replied, his fingers tightening around the phone until the case cracked. "I will." He turned toward his security chief, who was standing in the shadows of the study with a hand hovering over his weapon. The pre-earthquake silence of the room solidified into a clinical finality. Dong-min's posture was deliberate and controlled as he began the heavy discipline of tracking a target. "Bring the car," Dong-min commanded, his voice vibrating with a raw, consuming want for justice. "And find out who else is at that address. If anyone touches what belongs to me, I will burn their entire operation to the ground." Aaliyah watched him go, realized that while Keisha had sold her for a payoff, Dong-min was ready to go to war for a stranger he had found in a bathtub. The purity of her old life was gone, replaced by a world of lethal elegance where the only thing more dangerous than the betrayal was the man protecting her from it. The penthouse was thick with the scent of cedar and the heavy, humid silence of the Seoul night. Seo Dong-min returned from the city, his presence a predatory stillness that seemed to swallow the light of the study. He had discarded his suit jacket, and the bold black ink of his tattoos pulsed against his pale skin like a warning. Aaliyah stood by the window, her white top clinging to her frame, her steady gaze meeting his as he crossed the room with a deliberate, controlled rhythm. The dangerous bubble of authority that usually separated them began to contract, shifting into a pressurized intimacy. Dong-min stopped inches from her, his cold, dark eyes searching hers with a restrained obsession that made the air feel thin. For days, they had navigated the boundaries of captor and protector, but tonight, the lines blurred into a raw, consuming want. "You should be afraid of me," Dong-min murmured, his voice a low, commanding hum that vibrated through the floor. "I've seen the monster," Aaliyah whispered, her courageous curiosity driving her to step closer until her chest brushed against his ink-covered arm. Dong-min's hand reached out, his tattooed fingers tangled in her wet, dark hair with a sudden, fierce possessiveness. The dynamic shifted instantly. It was no longer about the fortress of the penthouse or the war outside. It was about the forbidden intimacy of two souls drawn by betrayal and fate. As he leaned down, his brooding aura overwhelming her, Aaliyah didn't pull back. Instead, she tilted her head, her gaze intimate and fearless, inviting the danger she had once feared. In the pre-earthquake silence of the room, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The ruthless mafia boss and the woman he had claimed were no longer tethered by obligation, but by a powerful, mutual desire that threatened to burn both their worlds to the ground. The warehouse at the edge of the docks was a hollow shell of rusted steel and clinical shadows, smelling of salt and old blood. Aaliyah stood in the center of the vast, dimly lit space, her white top now a target in the darkness, her steady gaze locked on the woman who had once been her sister. Keisha stood beside a scarred man, the rival boss, her face a mask of desperate calculation that had replaced the loyalty Aaliyah once believed in. "I gave you everything," Aaliyah whispered, her voice a low, warm hum that vibrated with the weight of the betrayal. "I was always the lucky one, Aaliyah," Keisha countered, her chin lifting with a sharp, secret jealousy. "I just took the payoff I deserved." The rival boss stepped forward, his expression cold and professional. "You're a valuable piece of leverage, Miss Grant. Dong Min will surrender his shipping routes to get you back." The heavy obsidian doors of the warehouse detonated inward. Seo Dong-min emerged from the smoke, a predatory stillness in his movements as he strode forward with his head of security and 60 armed men. His wet, dark hair fell loosely around his face, and the bold black ink on his neck pulsed with a lethal, quiet menace. He didn't look at the rival boss. His cold, dark eyes were locked onto Aaliyah with a raw, consuming want. "I told you what would happen if you touched what belongs to me," Dong-min said, his voice a low, commanding hum that filled the hollow space. "You're overreacting, Dong-min," the rival gasped, his face paling as he saw the scale of the mobilization. "I'm ending this," Dong-min replied, his posture deliberate and controlled. He raised a hand, authorizing lethal force with a clinical finality. "I promise to burn your entire operation to the ground for her. Tonight, I keep that promise." Gunfire shattered the silence of the warehouse, a chaotic symphony of lethal elegance. In the middle of the storm, Dong-min reached Aaliyah, pulling her into a dangerous bubble of protection as he fired his weapon with practiced precision. He didn't care about the shipping routes or the territory. He only cared about the woman who had looked into his darkness and didn't run. As the rival's world crumbled into ashes around them, Aaliyah realized that the ruthless boss was the only sanctuary she had ever truly known. The heavy, humid air of Seoul's summer night hung over the private balcony of the high-security penthouse. But here, high above the neon-streaked mist, the wind carried a rare scent of peace. A year had passed since the night of the bathtub, the betrayal that had shattered Aaliyah's world, now a distant, fading echo. She stood against the railing, her hair slicked back in a style that emphasized her natural beauty and the confidence that had only deepened in the shadow of the underworld. She wore a white sleeveless top, its fabric catching the soft amber light of the suite behind her. Aaliyah wasn't alone. Seo Dong-min stepped out of the shadows with his signature predatory stillness, his presence a low, commanding hum of hidden authority. He had discarded his suit jacket, and the bold black ink of his tattoos, the intricate patterns, and the portrait of the woman he had lost were visible against his pale skin. He didn't move with the frantic urgency of a mafia boss at war. He moved with the deliberate, controlled rhythm of a man who had finally found his anchor. He stopped beside her, his proximity creating that familiar, dangerous bubble of intimacy. He reached out, his tattooed fingers grazing her arm before settling on her waist with a fierce possessiveness. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She leaned into him, her steady and intimate gaze locking onto his cold, dark eyes. "The city looks different from here," Aaliyah whispered, her voice a low, warm hum. "It doesn't look like a lion's den anymore." "That's because the lions are all inside," Dong-min murmured, his expression intense yet restrained. He looked out over the empire he had spent a decade building on fear and precision, but for the first time, his focus wasn't on the territory. It was on the makeshift family they had built from the ashes of Keisha's treachery. The betrayal had been a clinical destruction, a night of ice-cold water and lethal elegance, but it had led them to this crossing of dangerous boundaries. Aaliyah Grant was no longer just a guest or a weakness to be guarded. She was the heart of the fortress. As they stood together in the pre-earthquake silence of the night, the contrast between his dark, tattooed intensity and her soft yet fearless presence told the final story of their fate. They were a family born from a night of blood and ink, proving that even in a world of monsters, the most dangerous thing you can do is let yourself be loved. If this story stayed with you longer than the video itself, you might belong here. Subscribe and keep walking these stories with us.